Next, we have a session titled Measuring Health, one that actually matters to real patients. We have Marissa Cruz, Chief Medical Officer at Empatica, Erin Rinaldi, Head of Sensors Data Science at Verily, Nikki Batista, Vice President of Digital Health at Whoop, Patrick Anskowiak, our team lead of Neurosciences Diagnostics team here at FDA in the Office of Product Evaluation Quality, and finally, David White, a kidney warrior at the Light Collective. So let's start with the presentations. First off, Marissa Cruz.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. As mentioned, I'm Marissa Cruz. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Empatica. I'm also an actively practicing internist and endocrinologist. So privileged to be able to engage directly with patients and at least get a glimpse of the impact of technology on quality of life and clinical outcomes. Just as an introduction to Empatica, we are an MIT spinoff that was founded in 2013. And what I want to talk about today is how we use patient-generated health data to develop and improve our seizure detection products that are used by patients with epilepsy. Next slide. So patients have always been at the center of our mission statement, which is to create groundbreaking technology that is friendly, caring, and more human. The technology that we have built is a full stack FDA-cleared platform that includes a wearable device, a paired mobile app, and cloud-based infrastructure. And that platform is able to host algorithms that measure a range of biomarkers from blood oxygen saturation to electrodermal activity. And these biomarkers are used for a range of purposes, including remote patient monitoring and clinical care, decentralized clinical trials. So while the platform is disease agnostic and can be used to support research and patient care across a range of conditions, what I wanted to spend some time on today, and one that we're particularly proud of, is detection of convulsive seizures in patients with epilepsy, which is the first algorithm that we brought through the regulatory process. Next slide. So I think this definition is familiar to people by now, but we are focused on the definition of patient-generated health data, which per the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, is health-related data created, recorded, or gathered by or from patients or other family members or other caregivers to help address a health concern. As you already heard today, the ability to capture meaningful patient-generated health data, however, is conditioned on really building data capture technology that is usable, practical, and meaningful to patients. Next slide. So for our seizure detection algorithm, we really started with patient-centered design. We worked with patient advocacy groups like the Epilepsy Foundation and the Danny Did Foundation to identify the primary health concerns of people with epilepsy and their caretakers. And those health concerns include SUDEP, which is sudden unexplained death of epilepsy, as well as accidental deaths due to causes like fall injuries, car accidents, drowning, as well as the burden of managing their epilepsy, which for many patients is a chronic condition, often requiring multiple medications, specialty medical care, and a strong caregiver network. We also talked to patients about what their priorities would be for a seizure detection device and found that they were most interested in the topics listed below, which were clinical validation, so evidence that it works, level of accuracy of the algorithm, speed of caregiver notification, and cost. Next slide. So we set about designing this product, which was originally called Embrace. At the time we started this work, there were no seizure detection devices in the market, and our device remains the only device cleared by FDA for this purpose. We went through a traditional prospective clinical validation trial, which was studying adults and children with epilepsy who had been admitted to specialized epilepsy monitoring units. And working closely with FDA, we cleared the device as an adjunct for seizure monitoring in adults and children for use in home and healthcare settings and rest conditions. Next slide. In the interest of ongoing improvement, however, we continue to collect data and feedback from patients who are using the Embrace product. So in a post-market setting, some of the features that we heard most frequently requested by patients, by their caregivers, and healthcare providers were that they wanted to be able to wear the device during activity. As I mentioned, it was cleared for use during rest. And they wanted to have fewer false alerts when they did wear it while being active. Patients noted that if they were able to wear the device 24 hours a day, that would significantly increase their overall use, as there was a higher chance of forgetting to put on the device at night if you had to remove it during daytime activities. And we know that most missed seizures and SUDEP occur overnight, and so higher wear time could reasonably be linked to better clinical outcomes. In 2023, we decided to introduce a new product called EpiMonitor by migrating our seizure detection algorithm to an updated wearable device, the Embrace Plus, which you can see on the screen here. And in that process, we met with FDA to discuss how we could potentially expand our indication for use to include active conditions. Next slide. So patients generally stay in epilepsy monitoring units for several days. And so they do move around a bit, walking down the hallway, eating, going to the bathroom. And we had already evaluated the accuracy of our algorithm on patients in EMUs, in epilepsy monitoring units, during those more active periods, and found that by using a different seizure detection threshold, which we called low sensitivity, we could still accurately detect seizures with lower false alarm rates. And again, harkening back to what patients had told us that they were really looking forward to in the next iteration of this product. FDA reviewers, however, noted that these lightly active periods in this structured in-hospital setting weren't entirely representative of the range of activities that patients may want to pursue at home, which might include exercise, bike riding, reading, typing, etc. But we had years of patient-generated health data. We have people who have been relying on this device and actively wearing this device for many years, both in the EU, where the device actually is CE marked for use in active conditions, and from patients in the US, where some patients do wear the device off-label during activity. And so, again, working with the FDA, we designed a real-world study that evaluated all that data from patients using the device over a 3-year window. We limited our analysis to months of data where patients wore their device consistently, so we would know that they would be representative of a full range of activities that could occur during the daytime. And we limited the data set to patient months where we had a patient confirmation of all seizure events, so not relying only on the device output, but looking at those data where the patient confirmed that a seizure had occurred. Next slide. Then we used a validated algorithm to identify periods of activity in the analysis data set, and we're able to demonstrate equivalent accuracy of the high sensitivity and low sensitivity detection thresholds. So we could find seizures with equal accuracy. And we had a significantly reduced false alarm rate for the low sensitivity mode during periods of activity. We did end up clearing EpiMonitor in February of this year, based on both the findings from the EMU from the hospital setting, as well as the real world analyses. And then we also submitted usability testing, focusing on confirming that our messages about high sensitivity and low sensitivity, the risks and benefits, when to use which one, were clear and informative. Next slide. As a final note, just to underscore the ongoing role of patient-generated health data in all stages of the product life cycle, we've also heard from the epilepsy community that there's substantial interest in being able not only to detect seizures, but also to predict them using machine learning and based on risk factors and triggers that are specific to an individual patient. Seizure forecasting is quite complex, and it will certainly require additional conversations with FDA to determine the appropriate regulatory pathway. But we have launched a real-world trial using the patient-generated data from EpiMonitor to begin to collect the data needed to develop this algorithm. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Marissa. We love that case example about patient-generated health data in epilepsy. Next, we will have a case example on Parkinson's by Erin Rinaldi.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline, and thanks, Marissa. So much of what you said resonates deeply with me and with the work we've been doing here at Verily as well. So you can go ahead to the next slide. So as Jacqueline said, I'm going to present a case example of our team at Verily's development of remote monitoring of Parkinson's disease using our Verily Study Watch. I wish actually I had added a slide like Marissa did at the beginning of her deck, just as a quick overview of the watch and the platform. It's a similar watch that can be used across many different therapeutic areas, but the case example I'll focus on here is specific to Parkinson's disease, how we collected and used patient-generated health data throughout the process. And go ahead to the next slide. So our goal was to develop and deploy a skill check for Parkinson's disease. And the reason we chose this is because right now, Parkinson's disease progression and severity is measured typically in clinic by a clinician through an exam called the MDS-UPDRS. And it can be pretty high burden for patients and clinicians to do this exam. Typically in the standard of care, it happens maybe once every 6 months or once a year. And in the course of a clinical trial, it might be more frequent, but it's still not every day or every week even. And so our goal was to find a way to develop a skill check such that patients or participants could do this at home and get a similar set of information that they would get from doing an MDS-UPDRS in the clinic, but instead at home and more frequently. You can go ahead to the next slide. And so we started out by talking to people with Parkinson's disease. We took a first pass at designing the app on the watch that patients could work through in the home setting, but we tested it with people with Parkinson's first. We wanted to make sure that the reading on the user interface on the screen was legible. We wanted to make sure that the haptic signals, the buzzing on the watch, that the users could feel it. We wanted to make sure that they understood the directions and could accomplish all of the tasks in the way that they were intended. Go ahead to the next slide. And so the first lesson here is to listen to the patient. During this user testing, we discovered that mostly this was a pretty usable tool for people to use at home, but there were some things that were challenging, especially as we looked across a diverse population. And here, what I mean by a diverse population is people with different levels of severity of Parkinson's disease. And in particular, this participant number 3 with more severe Parkinson's disease couldn't actually feel the vibration on the watch to tell them that a particular task was done. And so through iterating across all of the different tasks in the skill check and across these participants, we learned some important lessons that we then incorporated into the design of the skill check. In particular, we updated the vibration strength and pattern so that participants could choose the pattern that worked best for them. We changed the icons in the user interface to be less abstract. We got some feedback that they didn't know what the icons meant. And so we were able to do a redesign there and make it easier to understand. And then in addition, we created a quick start guide, which I flashed briefly on the previous slide, that had a visual and in words and writing description of what each of the tasks were and what information they were meant to collect. You can go ahead to the next slide. So after the design and development phase, we get to deploying and monitoring. And there are a handful of images on this slide that I'll talk through. So the first is, again, listen to the patient. Survey the patients about their experience. Listen to what they have to say. Is this usable? Do they want to use it? Is it comfortable? Do they understand what they're supposed to do? After each deployment, we sent a survey asking patients and participants about their experience using the app and using the watch. The second is look at both actively collected and passively collected patient-generated health data from the places where it's been deployed. We can learn a lot, both from times where we have context-known information, when we know exactly what the patient is supposed to be doing, and from when we don't know. So the graph that you see in the middle here is just a depiction of the wear time in a study of people with Parkinson's disease in the Netherlands. As you can see, it ran a little longer than 2 years, and the daily wear time was averaging around 22 hours a day for the 2 years of this study. And this was that same group of participants that we first deployed the skill check to. And so you can learn a lot, but one thing that was mentioned in the the previous group was people also have to wear it and use it in order to get the data to be used for analyzing and learning new things, generating new insights. And then finally, we were able to assess the at-home data quality. So because patients and participants are doing this in the home setting, there are a lot more factors at play. They might not fully understand the instructions. They might be distracted partway through. They might need to pause and restart again later. And in particular, looking at the data quality, you can learn a lot from when people are being compliant with the instructions and when they're not. And you can use that in the downstream algorithm development, algorithm validation, and analysis. And so the picture that you see here, the participant is actually supposed to be resting with their hands face up in order to assess their rest tremor as they sit still. But you can see that they're resting with their hands face down. And the reason we ask them to sit with their hands face up is because if they sit with their hands face down, they can actually grip their legs, which can cause a diminishing of their tremor. And so we can tell from the accelerometer in the watch that they're not doing this task appropriately, and that allows us to do some QC of the data that we're collecting. You can go ahead to the next slide. So two things we learned from listening to the data. So we've already addressed listening to the patient. Now we'll talk about listening to the data. The first is that aggregating measures over time improves the reliability of the measures. So in the development of this skill check that people could do at home, we were aiming to get a score that mimicked something like an MDSU PDRS so that it could be used in clinical trials as a way to assess whether or not a drug is working. And in order to do that, you have to have a digital measure that's reliable. And one way we discovered to make the digital measures more reliable is by aggregating them over time. And so we actually deployed this in two settings, one in Japan, where participants were actually doing this every day, and another in the Netherlands, where they were doing the skill check once a week. And you can see that by averaging the scores from multiple exams, you get a higher level of reliability. You can go ahead to the next slide. And then the last big takeaway from listening to the data is that we only capture very little data about what's going on in an individual's life if we only look at what happens in the clinic. Rather, if we collect all of this data that wearable devices make possible in between these clinic visits, we can learn so much more about what's actually happening in a patient's real life. So on this graph, each column is a user, one participant who did a set of skill checks over time. And we're looking here at the arm swing acceleration from when they were walking. And each individual's column shows in blue the range of the values of their arm swing while they were walking during the skill check. And in the orange for that same column is the value from the one in-clinic skill check. And when we first showed this to one of our collaborators in the Netherlands, he was blown away. He was so excited. He said, I knew it. I knew we weren't capturing everything in the clinic. That was happening when people go about their daily lives. And so this was kind of the big aha moment takeaway from that. You can go ahead to the next slide. So finally, our learnings in progress. We did pursue the FDA's drug development tool clinical outcome assessment pathway for this skill check exam. And we didn't make it all the way through the submission, but we learned an awful lot by going through the process. One of those is to measure what matters to patients. And we do that by tying everything back to the meaningful aspects of health. And the example Marissa walked through did a great job of highlighting what that process could look like. The second is to work in consortia. Moving this field forward absolutely requires collaboration across everyone involved, from industry, academia, regulators, and I missed maybe the most important one here, which is patients in this list. And as part of our work, building upon what we've done before, we've joined several efforts in consortia. And then one more slide. Finally, listening to the patients allowed us to get to this statement, which is we should measure more symptoms passively. Although this skill check was a great way to know the context of what patients were doing and understand what was happening in those moments, it is a much lower burden to collect as much as possible passively. So a lot of our work moving forward has focused on how we can capture things without asking patients or participants to do anything additional. rather just let them live their lives while wearing a watch. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Erin. What a great presentation. Our final case example presentation will be from WHOOP by Nikki Batista. Nikki, take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki Batista, Vice President of Digital Health. You can go to the next slide. So WHOOP is a health and fitness company on the mission to unlock human performance. So a disclaimer here that all products and services of WHOOP are not medical devices. Next slide. So digital health technologies offer many potentials and promises, and I believe the biggest potential and its fullest potential can only be realized when we put patient centricity at its core. And we do this by the transformation of the power going from the healthcare provider to the patient or the user. Next slide. So to achieve patient centricity, we really have to be asking ourselves these questions. Are we building product around the patient? Are we empowering patients? This could be through education, insights, community building. And ultimately, are we advancing health literacy? We'll come back to what that means in a minute, but next slide. So Erin hit the nail on the head. We have to ask what really matters to people and to the stakeholders within the healthcare continuum. And so if we dive into this a bit, it's a bit obvious that what really matters to regulators, providers, and payers is not exactly what matters to everyday people. And that's why we're all gathered here today. And so what's really important for us to see is the dysynchrony or the difference between the two, and recognizing that while regulators, providers, and payers may want to see power to endpoints and health economic data, everyday people just want to feel better. And we need to dive into what that means and how can we quantify that. So take mortality, for example. If we're demonstrating through clinical trials that devices are reducing mortality rates, what does it mean if you're not really living with healthy years or able years? So the take home here on this slide is that all perspectives matter, but I would caution this entire ecosystem against a hyper focus on strictly meeting regulatory, provider, and payer requirements, because it can inadvertently remove the patient from the conversation. So never lose sight of the patient. Next slide. So the question really becomes, how do we transform these qualitative experiences, like I want to feel better, or I want to have more energy, or I want to have more able years, into objective measures? And I'm going to hypothesize and put it out today that it's health literacy that gets us there. You're probably asking, what is health literacy? The ability for people to access, understand, and use health-related information for themselves. Really going from not knowing where to look, how to ingest and interpret information for themselves. And really, if we don't address this health literacy issue, we'll continue to see costs, not just in monetary resources as cited below, but we'll never really be able to see the full potential of digital health. Next slide. So at WHOOP, we provide our members with easy to understand and actionable insights that are educating members on their physiology every day, so that they can more readily associate their qualitative experience of either not having energy in a day with a quantitative measure. So we're seeing health literacy through the use of general wellness biometric monitoring wearable devices. Next slide. So the WHOOP experience is truly marked by everyday people, everyday metrics, providing novel insights that's supporting health literacy through the power of longitudinal 24/7 data. Erin mentioned we got to get people to wear devices, and it's important that we capture and really develop products that people want to wear 24/7. So as we discuss and collaborate on the utility of patient-generated data, I'd like to share some insights from the consumer world that hopefully can benefit the medical device space. Next slide. So the first lesson is be user-obsessed. We've been hearing this a lot. Or at WHOOP, what we say is be product-minded. So we're constantly obsessed with the experience of the end user and establishing a continuous feedback loop on their experience, it drives developing products that people want to keep on their bodies or wearables that people want to keep on their bodies. And what's important is it allows us to stay connected to our audience, to the community that we're trying to serve, and prove that we're actually listening and their feedback is valuable. So an example here on the left is recently Whoop added the demands of parenthood to the activities that you can track and get credit for in your strain scores within our ecosystem. Next slide. Lesson 2 is make it magical. We constantly are thinking about how do we make magical experiences for people who want to use our products. At Whoop, it starts from the unboxing experience, but how it can translate to medical devices is thinking about even from enrollment within a clinical trial. We cannot solely rely on the altruistic nature of humans to be citizen scientists. We have to give them value. And so I encourage everyone to think about not just the value proposition for who you're selling your product to, but the value proposition to patients. And they want to see how it influences their day-to-day. So here at Whoop, what we do is we're explaining complex physiological phenomenon to everyday people using plain language, reinforcement through constant feedback with high value, high impact. So the example here on the right side shows the very accessible way to interpret a recovery score based off of a 0 to 100 percentage and color-coded categories. Next slide. Lesson 3, meet people where they are in their health journey. So thinking through various personas is one way to be product-minded. Segmenting your audience into different types of patient journeys is really critical to think about how you would design your product and the experience you want your patients to have throughout the use or involvement in a study or interaction with the device. Take a woman's health journey, for example. It has various stages. And for example, pregnancy, it's not technically a medical condition, but it's treated like one. And Whoop has generated a body of evidence that we have published that shows the trends, the population-based trends of both heart rate variability and resting heart rate throughout the trimesters and postpartum phases of pregnancy as a way to transform this in educating our pregnant members on what to truly expect when you're expecting in your physiological data. And the important thing is to make it approachable. Next slide. And the last lesson is connect the dots. So patients can't always articulate how they feel or why they feel off, but as we educate them on their physiology and improve their health literacy, they're able to see the connections between how they qualitatively feel and the quantitative data their physiology is telling us. And this is really where I think the empowerment and the activation of them becoming participants within the healthcare, within their journey. And so an example here is during COVID, we saw respiratory rate data being associated with testing positive for COVID. So again, it's really about connecting the dots. So next slide. And so in summary, we need objective measurements to capture the qualitative experiences of patients. And so I put it out into the ether that it's health literacy that we really need to be focusing on. And I believe that consumer wearables will play a really instrumental role in supporting the utility and use of patient-generated data. So thank you.
Nikki, thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you to our other presenters as well. Now we'll open it up to a panel discussion, and it will be led by our FDA team lead who reviews devices for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So take it away, Patrick.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks to all the presenters. And I apologize for my darkness. I'm a little bit backlit here. So the presenters, you included some really fabulous examples of including patient feedback to change device features or to influence the direction of a future product. I'd like to throw the first question out to Dave, our patient advocate, who's done a lot of great work with kidney patients. So from a patient perspective, at what point in the product design or clinical study design process do you want to be included? And how can companies and investigators best seek and incorporate this kind of feedback?
Oh, thank you, Patrick. Hi, everyone. So I just want to, I self-identify as a kidney warrior first. I'm a very grateful kidney transplant recipient. In a couple of weeks, I'll mark my 9th anniversary of receiving a kidney transplant from a deceased donor. And before that, I endured 6 years of dialysis, and I'm just a very honored and grateful to be speaking with you all here today. And I want to thank my colleagues Pamela and Marissa and Erin for fantastic presentations. I was very silently applauding when I was hearing a lot of good things that you're all doing. And I heard a lot of similarities, and I think that you all get it. So thank you for that. Patrick, to answer your question, I was listening to my colleague, my good friend Mike, in the earlier discussion, and I have to start where he finished and say that I want to be included at the start of every project. Send me an email when a product's concept is being discussed, and I'll be very happy. And I'd also like to be comfortable pitching product concepts during the discussion, because hopefully that level of comfort, already exists. And I know that can be hard to do, but it can be achieved because I've experienced it multiple times. Some ideas to make that happen are convening patient advisory boards that are standing, evergreen, or, advisory boards, whatever you want to name them. If you want to, a sponsor wants to keep the dialogue going for a long time, like several years, 5 years, even more. Once that relationship is ongoing, you can partner with us to convene focus groups or one-off discussions for projects that have shorter timelines. Nonprofits, experts in health conditions. Marissa mentioned that. That's a great idea because those are built-in networks. Patient advocates like myself and Mike, each of us have our own network, and they're different networks. So when you combine all of that, you really have a powerful reach. And another option is to build your own trusted network. Again, trust, social media is kind of sketchy in that regard, but you can develop newsletters, develop your own blog, invite us to contribute and spread the word, and sponsors can be trusted messengers that way. And again, it's sort of a recurring theme that we've heard is the most important thing is to empower us to define our best future state, because that's the best future state for all of us, and make sure that we have the tools to work with you to achieve it. Nikki's comment about work developing that's staying in the green, that's perfect. But if a tool like that doesn't exist, we can develop it together. We have insights about what we need to improve our quality of life that need to be incorporated into product design from day one. So those are some of my thoughts, Patrick.
Great, thanks, Dave. That is just fantastic feedback. I'd like to also throw it out to the panel if they had sort of any additional thoughts or examples of utilizing patient feedback to in their product design or study design process. And it can be either, successful examples or things that weren't successful and you learned from.
Yeah,
Erin?
I can give an example. So one of the things I briefly touched on in the slides was that we tried deploying the skill check both at a daily cadence and a weekly cadence. And we got feedback and compliance data back that indicated that doing it every day was a really high burden. And doing it weekly was better, and doing it monthly might be even better. But it all depends on how long you plan to collect the data for as well. If you're looking at a 2-year longitudinal study, monthly might be okay. If you have a much shorter trial that's 14 weeks, then maybe weekly might be better. But daily, I'm not sure we would do that again.
I was going to say something similar, which is I touched on the seizure forecasting study that we've launched recently, and we've been grappling with the same issue of frequency, right? And what frequency means to different patient populations. You can imagine that someone who has daily seizures or seizures multiple times a week would be very much interested in an hourly or daily sort of risk score, where someone who has 2 seizures a year, a daily risk score might not be particularly meaningful, right? And so as you think about not only the accuracy of the algorithm, thinking also about that level of time and what that means to different subgroups of patients, I think has been an issue that we've been grappling with and talking to people to better understand.
Sure. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Any thoughts, Nikki? Anything to add?
No, I think they covered it well.
Great. So I'd like to direct this question to probably Erin and Marissa in particular. What are some of the incentives that you see in incorporating patient-generated health data into device development?
Yeah, I mean, I would say principally it's patient adoption, right? That people aren't going to, you as a company are not going to make the impact that you're hoping for on clinical outcomes unless people use the thing that you're making. And people aren't going to use the thing that you're making if they don't understand it, if it's uncomfortable, if it's not intuitive, and if it's not designed around an outcome or piece of data that's really meaningful to them and their quality of life. So I think that's the primary driver. There's actually, I think, a number of reasons to pursue patient input in product development, but I'll just highlight that one and turn it over to Erin.
Thanks, Marissa. I 100% agree. That's the most important reason, which is if you don't build something that is intuitive, usable, understandable, the patients and participants won't wear it, and then you won't get the data you need to generate the insights you're hoping to generate.
Yeah, thanks. I see Nikki nodding, and I know that you presented a lot of information about sort of patient-centered design and making device features depending on what is really important to the patients. Do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I think the question to ask ourselves is put yourselves in the patient's shoes and say, they're going to ask, that all sounds great. It works. It's usable. Maybe I understand it, but what does it matter to me? Like, why do I want to keep using it? So I would just say that where we have found success is just providing value every day to the person using the product. So how can you add value to the patient's lives? That's not just collecting data or getting us an endpoint in some way, but how can you actually incentivize them through giving them value?
Yeah, and I think that in particular that aspect is maybe a bit more sort of prevalent or observable in the consumer device space, so things that you'll be using every day. Do you have any additional sort of teachings that you can provide from the consumer space that you think could be applied to device research, medical device research?
Yeah, not here to preach, but happy to help. I would say that just reemphasizing something I mentioned in my slide deck is when medical device companies often develop a business model or a business plan, they're thinking about value proposition to whoever's going to pay for the product. And I think that there needs within these business models a value proposition to the person who's going to be receiving it. And if we have that mentality, I believe that we can push the business elements that really drive medical device development to really be thinking about patient preferences and having that as a metric that is used for business success.
If I can build on that, Nikki, that is a great way to think about it. This is definitely one of the interesting lines kind of between the commercial device development and medical device development, where we specifically were thinking in our design, we actually don't want to give information in real time back to the participant because we don't want to modify their behavior. At the same time, that doesn't mean you can never give them any information back. So several ways we've thought about doing that with the study watch are one for the baseline health study population, which was just a general population of about 2,500 people who wore the watch for up to 5 years, which is a very long time. We sent newsletters and reports back, not necessarily with their individual results, but with here's information we learned from your cohort. Here's something useful where we were able to push the field forward. And the same thing with the group in the Netherlands with Parkinson's disease. Again, this was a longitudinal study, observational. And there we had such an excellent rapport with the study coordinators in the Netherlands, and they had such an excellent rapport with all of the participants in the study because they held conferences for all of the people who were participating where everyone could come together and do the same thing, this kind of like insight sharing. Here's what we've learned from all of this data. Thank you so much for giving us your data. Here's what we were able to do with it. So there's also, I think, a good conversation to be had about all of the different ways we can engage and share things back in the context of interventional trials versus observational trials versus care. I think there are lots of different approaches that can be useful and beneficial.
If I could just add what Erin just said about holding a conference and bringing the patients back to share what you've learned and to get additional feedback is that's just unbelievable. You know, I've actually never heard of a conference just to share feedback before, and that's like really the gold standard. You know, all too often, we are asked for information for a study and we share our information. Sometimes, you know, we bare our souls and we may not hear anything back. And that can be, you know, it's just not a good thing to do. But what you've done is not only, you know, the perfect thing, but I can't think of a better way to build trust and build loyalty. So, you know, the next time that, you know, you'll need them. You won't even have to ask. They'll be asking you, right?
Yeah, that is just like a really sort of fantastic sort of scenario that you described there, and it's really, really cool stuff. I saw a couple of questions in the chat that were kind of generally about usability and patient adoption. So I was wondering if maybe we could talk a little bit about how patient-generated health data supports usability so that it provides awareness and value to patients. Marissa, can you take a stab at that one?
Sure, absolutely. I think, you know, there are instances like the one that I pointed out in my slide deck around understanding what's important to patients, what's limiting usability. In this case, it was, you know, the limitation of use only in conditions of rest. We also think a lot about usability in the other application of our platform, which is for clinical trials. Other companies who are developing drugs or new medical devices use our platform in clinical research. And we think about usability in that sense, you know, as Erin mentioned, and many times that these are large scale trials, right? So how do we get the devices to people? How do we make sure that we are caring about things like how often you have to charge the device, right? How comfortable is it to use the device? How easy is it to clean the device, right? And then those same issues of when do you provide feedback to people, and how do you ensure mechanisms that they can provide feedback to you on an ongoing basis to make sure that the data that you're collecting for this longitudinal trial is as useful as possible. So I think doing the work up front to collect usability data to make sure that it's fit for purpose for these longitudinal large scale trials is incredibly important, and then having an active dialogue and mechanism of surveying patients and saying, how is this going for you? Where are there pain points that we can work on solving in an iterative way over the course of a trial or in the next phase of a trial are important aspects of this.
That's great, Marissa. Totally agree. One other thing I'll add that we've taken into consideration when designing our platform is like the technology divide and equity in that way. And part of the design decisions we made for whether or not to have a companion app or something else, we realized that the target populations we're likely trying to reach are older and probably less technically literate. And so we specifically designed around having an app. There's actually no need for a cell phone because not everyone has a cell phone or has a smartphone or knows how to use one. Back to a conversation that was just at the end of the last panel discussion about people having at-home internet access, high-speed internet access. We also have the ability to just pair with cellular network connectivity, so that again, we're kind of moving around the need for people to have all of the technology we kind of take for granted in the development space to make sure that people who don't have access to that technology or that technological literacy can still use and interact with the device without needing all of the extra background there.
Yeah, thank you both. I think you actually both raised up some interesting points about so the technology divide, obviously, that we sort of touched on in the prior session. And Marissa, also, you talked about doing the work up front to make sure that that your patient generated health data product is fit for purpose. So that kind of leads me to another sort of theme that was mentioned in the earlier sessions related to FDA's guidance about digital health technology for remote data collection. And I hope that this guidance is really going to advance the field and increase the adoption of patient-generated health data in trials. There's a lot of different digital health technologies out there. They have different designs and different uses and levels of validation, speaking to whether they're fit for purpose. Do you have any thoughts on the need for standardization? And I know that was also something that we touched on in some of the prior discussion. So, do you think there's a need for standardization, what are your thoughts on how sort of intra-device and inter-device variability in collecting this type of data sort of impacts, both clinical studies and how patients use these devices? That was a long question. I know, Nikki, I see you're coming off mute. I mean, Marissa, I'm sorry.
Okay. Sure, I can give it a first pass. So I do think that some degree of standardization is important in that we're all talking, when we say things like accuracy and precision and reliability, we're talking about the same concepts. And I think that applies across consumer and medical device digital health technologies. I don't think that we're probably going to get realistically to a place where all, smartwatches are operating on exactly the same, collecting data in the same way, the same sampling frequency, interpreted in the same way. But I think, I'm somewhat biased on the medical device side of things. I do think that the organizations like FDA and ISO have a real role in helping us to understand what good is, right? What an appropriate level of accuracy is for clinical research, how that can be meaningful to patients and to healthcare providers. I also think that probably recognizing the lack of complete standardization across the field, what's going to be most important is transparency, that we're communicating what it is that we measured, why we think it's important, why we think people should care about it and have trust in it, right? And we should make sure that we're proactively communicating those statements so people don't have to do a ton of digging to figure out how was this data generated, who was it studied on, what does it really mean to me? So I think it really is making sure more than there's standardization across devices, there's standardization in the type of information that people have access to about those devices.
I love that. I will build on that, that Dime has done such an excellent job leading some of this work, giving us the V3 framework to understand when we are talking about validation, what do we actually mean? That has been the most useful framework for both internal to Verily conversations about what we're doing, as well as externally with partners. The other thing that I'll tie back to again from the previous session, there was a conversation about there are 1,000 different measures related to sleep. Which ones actually matter and why? And how do we choose that? I'm not sure that we can get to like, here are the 3 most important things. I think where we could get though is again some work that Dime's been great at spearheading here, which is understanding in a given therapeutic area, what are the meaningful aspects of health that matter, and which of these digital measures that we could capture, for example, in sleep, correspond to those meaningful aspects of health. I think that is something that is definitely starting to converge a little bit in the field. And that in particular, as a standard, is a great thing to aim for.
And if I can build on that, I think that the best way that that could be achieved is by starting with, the patient's division of, what matters most to them. I had the pleasure of participating in a project with an organization called the Kidney Health Initiative, which is a public-private partnership between the FDA and the American Society of Nephrology. And we spent years building a roadmap to create a sort of construct for developing innovative devices and renal replacement therapy. And we started with the patient vision of an improved quality of life. And it was maybe, I think, about a dozen different attributes, ability to work, fewer medications, and things of that nature. And that was, we started with the end is the best way of putting it. And so we gave that information to all the stakeholders and said, here, this is what we want, work with this. And, the FDA said, okay, guys, you need to work with this, if that will ease, some of the regulatory burden that you have, if you make sure that you pay attention to measuring these things that matter to patients. And we also made sure that this CMS and all the other agencies were on board. So say if a device is approved by FDA, the payment pathway is ideally already there. So the device can come to market easier, and it's got a market that has helped develop it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I agree with everything that you guys just said in relation to that question. We're starting to get a little short on time, so I wanted to give you a chance to make sure that if there's anything that we haven't touched on about patient-generated health data that you could share your thoughts or things you'd like to see from the field, or what does the 2030 patient-generated health data look like? And I'd like to give that to Nikki to start.
Ooh, I love predicting the future. It's a hobby. No, I'm kidding. It's not. 2030, I would love to see a really cool convergence of consumer wearables with med device that enable the digital twin.
Very, very succinct and very solid recommendation. How about Marissa?
Sure. So I would say one thing that I would like to see is a continued investment in methodologies around real world evidence. I do think that the ability to help medical device developers innovate using lived patient experience, data from lived patient experience is really powerful. I think we need to be able to do it in a methodical and systematic way with the right sort of statistical approaches. But I think that the progress that's been made already has been great to watch, and I'm excited about seeing that develop. I would say, you know, my 2030 prediction, I actually was able to attend another workshop earlier this week from FDA and NIH on digital biomarkers, and there was a lot of talk about how we move past some of the classic, you know, largely clinic-based gold standards when we think about developing new products, whether it be drugs or devices, and start to use patient-generated health data and digital biomarkers in particular as the gold standard, as references for how we decide whether or not a new medical product should be accepted. And I do think that 2030, I'm hopeful that we'll have made significant strides in that direction.
Yeah, we hope so too. How about Erin? Any parting thoughts?
Yes. So my vision is pretty similar to what Marissa said, which is way more use of digital measures and digital biomarkers throughout the drug development process, in particular, being used as primary and secondary endpoints to get drugs cleared. But then also building on the other themes, I think both from Nikki and Marissa, was just understanding we can also continue to use this information in a phase 4 context from what happens when people are just living their lives out in the real world. There's tons of opportunity there, which I think we all recognize as an opportunity, but we haven't found the right methodologies and consistent frameworks for doing that end to end. The last thing I'll say is something I heard one of my colleagues say the other day, which is we are not designing for patients, we are designing with patients. And so I really loved that turn of phrase, and it's I think a nice thing to end with for this particular conversation.
Yeah, that's absolutely fabulous thought. And I think while we're talking about designing for patients, I can give Dave a last thought for before we have to end the session.
Sure, thank you. I guess in 2030, I would like to see the cost of one of these come way down to like $20. How about that? So, you know, and also be more durable. But basically the cost, I mean, that would really, really ensure that equity is built into what we're doing.
Yeah, I think we can all agree with that. Thank you all once again for your excellent presentations and this discussion. It's really just been, I find myself smiling and nodding and agreeing with a lot of what you said, almost everything, maybe everything. It's been great. I will turn it over back to our host.
Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for a fantastic session.